Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on real-time with pause combat systems in role-playing games, and if you looked at the thumbnail for this video, you're probably already taking to the comments and furiously typing a response about how I'm full of crap without even having watched the video. And if you're already taking to the comments, I suggest you hold off on that until you've watched the video, because it's going to be pretty painfully obvious if you did. Anyway, the gameplay you're seeing in the background is going to be of a couple of games that have real-time with pause combat. Most specifically, you're going to be seeing Pillars of Eternity and Pathfinder Kingmaker. And the simple reason for that is that's just what I happen to have installed right now, because I've been working on, in particular, Pathfinder Kingmaker for a while now, and I've been working on Pillars of Eternity on and off for the better part of a couple of years. Both of which are much to my chagrin, but that's more for the actual reviews that I plan on doing for both of those games. Anyway, point is, they both use real-time with pause combat, and they are both heavily inspired by Baldur's Gate, which is going to be the #1 thing people are going to constantly bring up in the comments, I guarantee you. The original Baldur's Gate released in 1998 and brought with it a real-time with pause combat system that was carried over into the other Infinity Engine games like Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment, and it served as the basis for the combat systems that you would see in Neverwinter Nights, Knights of the Old Republic, and eventually Dragon Age, at least on the BioWare side of things. And as far as Obsidian's games go, you would see it in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and of course you would see it in the likes of Pathfinder Kingmaker, as well as the upcoming Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. The idea is that you control your entire party of adventurers, and you can order them to go all over the place. You can set formations for them as they travel around. You can have them trigger different special abilities. In some of the games, you can set up different patterns of behavior, like particularly Dragon Age Origins, and they'll just behave automatically based on certain parameters. And for a fairly specific subset of the role-playing game community, it is the be-all, end-all combat system. And before I start talking about why real-time with pause combat is not the be-all, end-all combat system, I'd like to go ahead and clear up a few misconceptions that people might have. First, there were real-time combat systems in role-playing games and dungeon crawlers prior to Baldur's Gate. In fact, there was real-time with pause combat prior to Baldur's Gate. If you've never heard of it, which I would expect you haven't, considering it is relatively obscure, there is a game called Darklands that was released in the early 90s that is real-time with pause combat. It is also a game that is extremely difficult to get into these days, and even back when it was still relatively new, it was a pretty niche game, so I can't blame you if you can't get into it, but it was something that existed prior to Baldur's Gate, and it did have real-time with pause combat. Second, I am not opposed to the idea of real-time with pause combat. Some of my favorite role-playing games actually have real-time with pause combat. Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, which is my favorite role-playing game, is much better played on turn-based, but it does have a real-time mode. And even aside from that, other games that I recommend very highly, like Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, as well as Neverwinter Nights, Dragon Age Origins, and to a lesser extent Dragon Age 2, all have real-time with pause combat systems. A game having a real-time with pause combat system does not preclude it from being a great game. In fact, some of the best RPGs out there happen to have real-time with pause combat systems. The misconception that people seem to be running into is that those games are not necessarily good because of their combat systems. In fact, I would argue that most of them are good in spite of their combat systems. It's a lesson that just about anybody who actually played Planescape Torment will understand very well. That game is absolutely amazing. It is one of the best role-playing games ever made. But it's certainly not because of the combat. Combat in Planescape Torment is downright awful. And it highlights something that's very important to understand regardless of which combat system you're using in a role-playing game. Using one system or another isn't necessarily going to mean that your game is going to be better or worse. It's how you use it. So with those couple of misconceptions out of the way, let's go ahead and actually start talking about real-time with pause combat and maybe advantages it has over turn-based as well as disadvantages. And the first thing I have to mention is that a lot of people seem to think real-time with pause combat is much more tactical, or it has much better tactical options. But it really doesn't have any more or less tactical options than turn-based combat does. It just depends on how you set up the individual systems in comparison to one another. I mean, to give you a prime example, one of the things people tend to cite about real-time with pause combat versus turn-based is that you can have a bunch of actions going off simultaneously in real time, whereas in turn-based you can't do that because everybody just takes their turn individually. That's not necessarily true. You certainly don't see it very often because it tends to clutter up the works very quickly, but certain turn-based games will let you have simultaneous actions of some degree, whether it be systems like being able to move while other people are taking their turns, or having characters go on multi-turn actions that will end up going off on the same turn as one another, or even have situations to where if an enemy does something, then an action will trigger from multiple characters on your team, or whatever the case may be. So while it's certainly a given that you're going to have simultaneous actions in real-time with pause, it's not necessarily true that it can do that while turn-based can't. So get that notion out of your head as well. That said, there might be certain advantages to real-time with pause combat versus turn-based. If you want your game to be at a faster pace, then real-time with pause might be the solution to that, because generally speaking, real-time with pause combat is over more quickly than turn-based is. Well, unless you're playing Dragon Age Origins, which has extremely sluggish real-time with pause combat. It's just so sluggish, in fact, that it actually makes it hard to go back and try to play it again. But I'm digressing a bit here. You will also see certain proponents of real-time with pause combat saying it's more cinematic, although I'm not entirely sure what they mean by that, because there are plenty of turn-based systems out there that have completely over-the-top animations that basically qualify as cinematics themselves. So I have a feeling that people who are saying it's more cinematic are just talking out of their ass and trying to say something that sounds profound. But another common argument in favor of real-time with pause is saying that it is more immersive than turn-based combat, that turn-based combat is very gamey. And to that I just have a simple question. How is it more immersive? Because you're having to pause the game constantly to issue orders to all of your characters. And more often than not, the pathfinding in real-time with pause games isn't all that great, so you'll have to constantly wrangle your characters in so they don't go wandering off and doing something stupid. And even when you're not having to go wrangle your characters in from going off on weird pathfinding adventures and not pausing the game to issue orders, and you actually have the combat running as intended, you're going to be noticing that there's a lot of standing around while they're waiting for their rounds to come up. In my experience, that's just as immersion-breaking as structured turns are, so I really don't see where you're getting that. So that basically leaves the major advantage that real-time with pause combat has over turn-based at it's a bit faster than turn-based combat is on average. Okay? I can see that being a good thing if you've got a lot of trash encounters and you just want to get through them as quickly as possible, but the way you fix that problem is by having good encounter design. You need to think about why you might be considering faster combat to be an advantage. If it's because the encounter design is not very good and the combat is boring, therefore you want it to be over as quickly as possible, that's not real-time with pause having an inherent advantage. That's it compensating for a weakness in the game's design. Now sure, that weakness is going to be more apparent in a turn-based system, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the real-time system. It's just that the real-time system might make it a bit less obvious. So if you think about it, real-time with pause combat being faster than turn-based isn't necessarily an advantage either. It does make covering up for certain mistakes a bit easier, but if those mistakes are egregious enough, then there's no amount of real-time being faster that will save it. And what I've found in the many years I've been playing RPGs now, the real-time with pause combat system works best when it's on a fairly small scale, when you have a small party up against another fairly small party of enemies. We're talking party groups of about 3 or 4 versus groups of enemies that number about 5 or 6 at absolute most. That's about as much as real-time with pause combat can reasonably handle before things just turn into a blob of your party up against a blob of the enemy, and it just becoming an absolutely chaotic mess. And those of you who have played Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale or Pathfinder Kingmaker or Pillars of Eternity, games where you have party groups that are larger than about 3 or 4, you're dealing with parties of about 5 or 6, will be able to easily recall numerous instances where you'd be going up against an enemy group, and no matter what you tried to use as your tactics, no matter how you tried to set things up, you would inevitably just end up with a blob against another blob. And that's a problem that's not just inherent to real-time with pause combat in RPGs, it's a problem with real-time combat in anything that has you controlling groups of individual units. The thing is, at the scale of a real-time strategy game, you're not going to care about that issue because you're dealing with large groups of units. And generally speaking, all of those units are going to have the same exact statistics as one another, and you're not going to need to worry about managing each one individually. At the scale of a role-playing game, on the other hand, you need to manage each one of your characters individually. You need to know exactly where they are and what they're doing at any given point. And if you end up with enemy party blob going up against your party blob, then that's a pretty nasty problem. This is why you have to be pausing constantly if you're going to be playing a real-time with pause combat system properly. You need to make sure that you're constantly moving your guys around so they're not getting stuck in the blob. You need to make sure that you're constantly pausing in order to queue up actions for your characters to complete on their next round action. And of course it goes without saying that whenever your characters take a particularly nasty hit, you're going to pause that in order to try to get them out of the fray or get somebody immediately to interrupt whatever they were doing before to try to heal them or whatever the case may be. And at that point, you're basically not playing real-time combat anymore. You've ended up with it being nominally real-time with pause, but it's effectively turn-based. And in fact, if you're playing in particular a Dungeons & Dragons game like Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale, or you're playing Pathfinder Kingmaker, which is based on the Pathfinder system, which itself is basically Dungeons & Dragons 3.75, then it's not just effective turn-based. It's literal turn-based, just converted into seconds instead of turns. This is why you'll see characters just standing around after completing an action until they get around to completing whatever action they've got queued up. It's because they're waiting for the next round to begin before they complete their queued action. Now, of course, if everything is timed well, then that's not as much of a problem. I mean, look at the combat in Knights of the Old Republic, for example. If you've got characters getting into melee combat with each other, they're constantly going through animations where their blades are clashing and things like that. That's to help mask the rounds. Behind the scenes, it is still technically a turn-based system, it's just being done in real time, and if the animations are long enough, then you're not going to notice it as much. But you'll still notice it on occasion. For example, if you use a med pack in Knights of the Old Republic, then you'll just stop whatever you're doing and stand there for a few moments before you whip out the med pack and use it. Or if you have a character attack something that's targeting something else, you'll notice that your character will stand there and wait for their round action to be up before they attack whatever it is that you're telling them to attack. And this is all because, with those particular games, they are just converting the round structure of the tabletop games they're based on. In the case of Knights of the Old Republic, it actually uses the D20 system, which is the same underlying mechanics that power Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, and it's just converting those round structures into numbers of seconds. It's basically jury-rigging the tabletop mechanics into doing something they were never designed to do, and as a result, you end up with a fairly weird mechanical system when you really start to think about it. With the games that use that style of combat, and which are based on tabletop systems like, of course, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, Planescape Torment, and Pathfinder Kingmaker and all that, you end up with games that are always forcing the mechanics to work rather than mechanics that intuitively work. With games like Dragon Age, on the other hand, they're designed from the ground up to be real-time, so you don't end up with those weird artifacts of being converted from a turn-based system that was meant for tabletop play. But unfortunately, RPGs that use real-time with pause combat that were designed from the ground up to be real-time are very few and far between. The vast majority of them are just adapting some tabletop system into real time, from games like, of course, Baldur's Gate and all the other Infinity Engine games on up through Pathfinder Kingmaker and the upcoming Wrath of the Righteous, or even games like Drakensong. That one's a real-time with pause adaptation of The Dark Eye, and it also has the same exact weird artifacts of being adapted from a turn-based tabletop game in it. And going real-time with pause also introduces its own set of issues, the first of them being that it would be effectively unplayable if you didn't have the pausing feature. Cue people say, no DW, you can totally play a real-time with pause game without using the pause feature. I mean, sure you can play it that way, but it's not designed to be played that way. And once you go beyond that really small scale I mentioned earlier, where it's about 3 to 4 party members, then it becomes pretty much unmanageable. And there's another problem real-time with pause has with regards to being able to manage things, and that is multiplayer. You basically only have 3 ways you can handle this. Either you remove the ability to pause entirely, and that's most notable if you're doing a multiplayer versus game of some sort, like say Neverwinter Nights can be, or you give the ability to pause only to the host, or you can put in pause that everybody can use, but it's on a weird delay and it gets really messy. And those of you who've tried to play Baldur's Gate multiplayer will understand what I'm talking about there. It can get fairly messy. Now you may be saying, but the obvious solution is to have every single player only playing a single character. Well, at that point you don't really need the pause feature, so you can just remove it entirely, and thus you're not even using real-time with pause combat anymore. You gotta keep in mind that the pause is there to help you manage the entire party. If you've only got one character, then it's just not necessary. Of course, if you're making a game where you only play play as a single character the entire time, there's no reason to make it real-time with pause anyway. You'd be much better served making it a real-time action-based combat system, like in, say, The Witcher or Gothic or something like that. And on top of all of that, a game that uses a real-time with pause combat system needs to be very careful with just how complex it actually is mechanically, because once you get past a certain point, real-time with pause becomes more of a liability than an asset. Now thankfully it seems like developers of games that use real-time with pause combat understand this and they don't take it quite to that point, but it is still a potential issue if you're talking about the right mechanical system for it. In fact, Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition on up through, of course, its iteration as Pathfinder 1st edition is about as much as you want to take that in complexity. Because if you get mechanics that are more complex than that, then there's just going to be too much to keep track of at any given moment, and you're going to need to slow your pace down, which means that turn-based is going to be the optimal solution for something like that. In fact, with Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous taking things into the mythic scale, I'm actually kind of worried about it going a bit over-complex with the mechanics, because that's what the mythic stuff tends to do in the tabletop. So implementing that might actually push it beyond the boundary of what is viable in real-time with pause. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess. Anyway, the point is that real-time with pause needs to be handled extremely carefully for it to actually be a benefit to the game rather than just something that it does, or worse, a liability. Some games like Planescape Torment do not handle it well at all, whereas other games like Knights of the Old Republic do. But then there's the elephant in the room, the game that popularized the real-time with pause combat system. Baldur's Gate. A game which a relatively small but very vocal minority of the fan base for seems to think is inseparable from its real-time with pause combat. They seem to think that Baldur's Gate was made with the intention of taking the really boring Dungeons & Dragons turn-based combat and making it into the exciting real-time with pause system. That was never really what they were trying to do with Baldur's Gate. They were always just trying to take the experience of an epic Dungeons & Dragons full campaign and translate that into a PC game, because up to that point, basically every single Dungeons & Dragons game you could find was a dungeon crawler. And while dungeon crawling is certainly a major part of the Dungeons & Dragons experience, Baldur's Gate was meant to be more than just dungeon crawling. It was meant to bring you the full Dungeons & Dragons experience. It was meant to give you the feeling of gathering your party and venturing forth into a massive world of adventure, where you'll fight huge monsters and explore strange locations, find mystical artifacts, and go on epic quests. That is what Baldur's Gate was all about, and it nailed that. What it wasn't about was the real-time with pause combat. That was just an aspect of the game, and one that people got way too attached to, because the implementation of that in both Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 was just okay. It wasn't particularly bad, nor was it particularly amazing. It had its moments here and there, but it was just an aspect of the game, and again, one that people cling to way too much when they're thinking of Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate is all about the epic Dungeons & Dragons campaign. It's not about the combat. If you want a game that's all about the real-time with pause combat, just go play Icewind Dale, because that's all that game is. It is nothing but dungeon crawling, and it is boring as hell because of it. But because people get so wrapped up with the real-time with pause combat being a part of Baldur's Gate without really understanding what Baldur's Gate was really setting out to achieve, they attribute it to being a mandatory part of Baldur's Gate. And thus you'll end up with that extremely obnoxious vocal minority that seems to think Baldur's Gate 3 is abject heresy because it is turn-based as opposed to real-time with pause. Well, I have news for you, supposed fan of Baldur's Gate that seems to think Baldur's Gate 3 is not really Baldur's Gate because it's not real-time with pause. You have completely missed the point of Baldur's Gate. You have completely ignored why Baldur's Gate was so good in the first place, instead focusing entirely on a mechanic that frankly was not that good in Baldur's Gate. And you need to acknowledge a simple reality. Just because Baldur's Gate did things a certain way does not automatically make it the way it should be done. And yet I continue to see people constantly turning their noses up at turn-based RPGs that are fantastic just because they're turn-based and not real-time with pause. These people completely ignore the limitations of real-time with pause combat and insist that it is the way it should be done, that all RPGs should be real-time with pause. No, they shouldn't. The game should be using whichever combat system, or lack thereof for that matter, is best for it, for what the developers are trying to achieve with that particular game. If it's better as real-time with pause, go for it. If it's better as turn-based, go for it. Both of them are perfectly fine if they're done well, but real-time with pause has a much narrower margin for error. If it's not done well, then it quickly becomes a mess. It's not some silver bullet you can throw at a game in order to automatically make it better. I mean, look at Planescape Torment. Real-time with pause combat does not help that game in the slightest. The combat is terrible in it. But an RPG is a hell of a lot more than its combat system, and Planescape Torment's other aspects hold it up and make it one of the best RPGs ever made. And in general, games that go a lot heavier on the combat and use real-time with pause tend to be a lot less interesting in the long run. I mean, Icewind Dale is nothing but dungeon crawling. It's basically nothing but combat, and it's pretty boring as a result. And mechanically, it is nearly identical to Baldur's Gate. So if the combat in Baldur's Gate was what made that game so good, then theoretically that should make Icewind Dale so good as well. Except it doesn't, because again, RPGs are a hell of a lot more than just their combat. And if you've got a good combat system on top of everything else being good, then you've got yourself a good RPG. By the same token, if you've got mediocre combat but the rest of the game is really good, you've still got yourself a good RPG. But if you've got mediocre combat and the rest of the game is also mediocre, then you've got a mediocre game. That's what happened with Icewind Dale. It's not a bad game, it's just dull. Baldur's Gate was a good game in spite of its combat being mediocre. Planescape Torment was a good game in spite of its combat being terrible. And there are plenty of turn-based RPGs out there that are the same exact way. Just because the combat is one over the other does not automatically make it better or worse. It's how they do it. And if the developers decide that they want to go turn-based, that doesn't make the game automatically inferior to your preferred real-time with pause system. By the same token, if a game is going turn-based, that doesn't automatically make real-time with pause inferior. What does make it inferior, on the other hand, is trying to force things to be real-time that were never designed to be real-time. Because no matter how you try to adapt that turn-based system into a real-time one, it's just not going to work the same. And frankly, I don't know why you would bother with that in the first place. It's a lot of work for really not much benefit, if any benefit at all. It might even be an outright detriment. I mean, according to Steam, I'm about 32 hours into Pillars of Eternity and about 84 hours into Pathfinder Kingmaker, and let me tell you, real-time with pause combat has not been helping either of them. And best I can tell, both of them were developed with the mentality of trying to be nostalgic, trying to harken back to the good old days of CRPGs, the days of Baldur's Gate, and thus they went with real-time with pause combat. Not because it was the better option, not because they really had developed their real-time with pause combat to a very fine edge, no. They developed them as real-time with pause games out of pure nostalgia, just because Baldur's Gate did it. Well, you know what? Baldur's Gate also ran off of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition rules, which means that we should probably all be going right back to using THAC0 again, right? I mean, it's not like that was a completely arbitrary, extremely gamey mechanic that introduced additional mathematical equations you had to keep track of and completely overcomplicated the armor class system to the point where nobody really understood how it worked. It was a central mechanic in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. Baldur's Gate used Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition rules. That must mean it's perfectly fine. In fact, it's probably the best way to do things. There couldn't possibly have been a better system than that was introduced in Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition and has been used ever since or anything. Nah, couldn't possibly be. Thank you all very much for watching. And if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on later videos.